بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. السادة الحضور الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يطيب للهيئة السعودية للمحاسبين القانونيين في البداية أن تشكركم على تفضلكم بحضور هذه المحاضرة، والتي هي بعنوان ما الذي يجعل منشئات الأعمال متيقظة للظروف الجديدة، والذي تقوم الهيئة بتنظيمها بالتعاون مع معهد المحاسبين القانونيين في إنجلترا وويلز في إطار الملتقيات والمحاضرات الدورية التي تعقدها الهيئة. يتحدث في هذه المحاضرة السيد توم روجرز، المدير المساعد لمجموعة استشارات ماكرو الاقتصادية. سيتطرق فيها حول تأثير انخفاض أسعار البترول والحاجة لزيادة الضرائب والمخاطر على استقرار أسعار صرف العملات. الآن أترك الميكروفون لسعادة الأمين العام للهيئة السعودية للمحاسبين القانونيين الدكتور أحمد بن عبد الله المغامس ليتفضل مشكورا ببدء الملتقى.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. بداية نشكر جامعة الأمير سلطان على الاستضافة هذا الملتقى، كما نشكر الأخوة والأخوات الحضور على حضور هذه المحاضرة. تأتي المحاضرة حقيقة في إطار التعاون مع معهد المحاسبين القانونيين بإنجلترا وويلز، تنفيذا لمذكرة التفاهم الموقعة معهم على عقد الندوات، المؤتمرات والدورات التدريبية. سيكون لدينا بإذن الله في السنة القادمة عدة تعاونات أيضا مع المعهد. أولا في مارس إن شاء الله 8 مارس 2017 ستكون الهيئة السعودية قد أتمت 25 سنة، فيعتبر اليوبيل الفضي للهيئة، وسيقام في هذا المؤتمر حفل نقول خاص بالهيئة، وسيكون هناك مؤتمر بالتعاون مع معهد المحاسبين القانونيين بإنجلترا وويلز. يسعدني الترحيب بالزملاء من معهد المحاسبين القانونيين، وأيضا يسعدني أن أطلب من السيد مايكل أرمسترونغ to speak a little bit about our cooperations. يتكلم عن التعاون الذي بيننا وبينهم، وكذلك سيقدم المحاضر لكم، فليتفضل مشكورا.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Armstrong, and I thank Dr. Megamas for the kind introduction just now. I'm here today to represent the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales. I'm pleased to say that globally our institute has 147,000 members across the globe, and these are qualified chartered accountants. Part of our institute's contribution to our members and our stakeholders is to share our economic and insights that we produce together with Oxford Economics. I have the pleasure this evening of being here at the first time to launch the Economic Insight Middle East here in Riyadh. This is our Q4 Economic Insight for 2016. We have 4 publications each year, and these are produced in English and in Arabic. And if those of you who don't have the fortune to pick up the hard copy that's available outside, both in English and Arabic, one can always resort to our website to have access to the publications of Economic Insight. I want to take this opportunity to introduce our guest speaker today from Oxford Economics. His name is Tom Rogers, and I would just like to share with you a brief overview of his achievements and why we're fortunate to have him with us today. Tom Rogers is an Associate Director of Macroeconomic Consulting in EMA. Tom joined Oxford Economics in September 2010, following 9 years as an economist and economic advisor in a range of roles within Her Majesty's Treasury and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, including tax policy, UK macroeconomic forecasting, and emerging market economics. During his time with Oxford Economics, he's contributed to and project managed consultancy and forecasting across many areas of the globe. Tom was Senior Economic Advisor to the EY Eurozone Economic Forecast, and in this role, he appeared on an array of media outlets, including BBC TV and radio, Sky News, Bloomberg, CNBC, and many more. Tom is Senior Economic Advisor to our institute, ICAEW, and in this role he has responsibility for project management of our economic insight reports across the emerging markets. In short, I believe we're very fortunate to have Tom with us today, and I think you've had enough from me in the pleasantries of introductions. I would certainly want us to crack on with a very exciting special briefing that we've arranged for you this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those kind words, Michael, and thank you also to Dr. Ahmed Almagamez and his colleagues at SOCPA for the invitation to come and speak today, and also to our hosts here at Prince Sultan University for the use of their facilities. Great pleasure to be here. As Michael said, we at Oxford Economics have been partnering with the ICAEW for about a year now to help ICAEW develop its voice on economic affairs around the world. We do this across a suite of products in the UK, but also with economic insight reports on a quarterly basis for the Middle East, for Greater China, for Africa, and for Southeast Asia. And the theme that we've chosen to explore for the 2016 Q4 reports is really to look into 2017 and say, what are the business risks that are keeping business people awake at night as we move into the next year? Now, in the context of the Middle East, obviously that kind of discussion has to start with an assessment of what's going on around the world oil markets. Not just latest developments, prospects for supply and demand around the world, what that means for prices, but also the risks that people should be aware of when they're thinking about oil prices in the years ahead. And we're particularly interested in the potential impact of, for example, Donald Trump's policy agenda on world oil prices, and also the potential for a slowdown in China and what that might mean for global oil. That's interesting, but it's probably also more important to actually bring it home to the GCC economies, Saudi, and to think about what it means for government policy and how those government policies might impact on businesses themselves. So in particular, how might lower oil prices impact on government spending in the years ahead? What might governments have to do in terms of tax policies to help close those fiscal deficits that are starting to emerge? And how does it all feed into other areas of policy like the labour market, diversification, and also developments in exchange rate policies? So there's a lot of things that businesses need to be aware of as we move into 2017 and a low oil price environment. And we'll talk through some of those issues in the next few slides. And then we'll come back to more recent economic developments and have a little look at what we think the impact of the recent Saudi Arabian bond issue are and what it means for liquidity pressures, not just here in Saudi Arabia, but also potentially across the rest of the region. And then I'll just finish by giving you our latest overview of the economic outlook across the region and some conclusions. So, as I'm sure you're all aware in this room, oil prices have fallen through the $50 a barrel mark about 18 months ago and have been pretty much stuck there ever since. And that's really because in 3 of the last 4 years, the world has produced a lot more oil than it needed. About $1 million barrels per day more in production than it was growing in demand. And 3 key economies have been the sources of that extra oil. Obviously, the sanctions deal in Iran, which saw Iranian oil exports double within the course of the year. Extra oil production in China has also been quite important. But probably the big story, as you're all aware, is shale producers in the US and the emergence of very nimble oil producers in America. Now, the fall off in oil prices over the past 18 months has actually caused some of that supply to come off. And as a result, as we move into 2017, the oil market is probably closer to balance than it has been for at least the last 2 years or so. Supply has fallen by around 500,000 barrels per day, and demand has remained relatively stable. And so that gap between world supply and world demand has narrowed. Does that mean that we think that oil prices are about to start rising again to anywhere near that $100 a barrel that we saw from 2010 to 2013? Well, we think not. And one of the key reasons why that is because world GDP is going to be growing far more slowly in the years ahead than it was over the past 20 years. This chart just sets out the average GDP growth rate from 96 to 2016 and from 2016 to 2020 across some of the world's major economies. As you can see, for most of the world's major economies, the difference is fairly slight. But for the economy that contributed 50% of the world's growth in demand for oil over that last 20 years, there's a big difference. China is growing 3 percentage points slower in the next 5 years than it did in the last 20 years. And that means a much slower rate of growth in the global demand for oil. Now, in addition to that, there's also a lot of extra supply around the world. We talked about some of the countries where oil supply has risen over the past few years. But what you can see in the US is that actually oil supply has responded very nimbly to the fall off in oil prices. Oil production in the US has fallen by around 1 million barrels per day since 2015. And actually, we think that a lot of that production would become viable again if oil prices were to start rising to $55, $60, $65 a barrel. So when you put those extra supply and weak demand growth together, what you get is a fairly weak outlook for the world oil price over the coming few years. We think the oil price is going to average around $50 a barrel in 2017 and grow to just about $60 by the end of 2019 and on to around $65 a barrel by the end of this decade. So that's pretty depressing news to start with, to be honest. But when you start to think about the possible risks in the global economy and the risks to global demand, then actually there's a very real risk that oil prices could be substantially lower. We've simulated a couple of scenarios whereby China slows its real estate sector because there are clear signs of a bubble in China's housing market at the moment. And if China were to slow its real estate sector, that could slow oil prices over the course of our forecast by around $5 a barrel. And if Donald Trump were to impose his full range of protectionist measures against China and Mexico and really slow world trade growth, that would have an even more disastrous impact as far as the oil price were concerned. That would take around $10 a barrel off over the course of the next 5 years. So all of this really leaves governments in the Middle East region facing a tough new reality, a tough fiscal reality, that they've lost somewhere between 10 and 20% of their GDP in terms of oil and gas revenues. In Saudi Arabia, the difference between oil and gas revenues for the government in 2013 and in 2015 is 15% of GDP. That's a story that's more or less true in different parts of the GCC. Oman is probably the worst hit, but nevertheless, even those that have seen a lower impact have seen something like 10% of their GDP lost in oil and gas revenues. Now, That matters because it pushes governments into deficits. And even in economies such as across the GCC, where government debt was very low to start with in 2012, 2013, you can't sustain deficits on the order of 5 to 10% a year without debt starting to quickly become unsustainable. And so governments need to very quickly put their fiscal accounts back into balance. One obvious way that they're planning to do that is to start cutting government spending. Now, we've seen a start in this respect in some parts of the GCC, but some parts of the GCC have waited a little longer to get going on austerity measures, and we think the greatest squeeze over the next few years is probably going to be concentrated in UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain and Oman. In Kuwait and Qatar, some of those early cuts were made a little earlier in this decade, and as such there's probably less fiscal squeeze to come in the years ahead. Now, this matters for business, of course, because the government is an important source of demand within these economies. It's a key demander of goods and services. It's also a key driver of the construction trade. When I came here yesterday evening, I just could see the construction work going on all around me, the Riyadh Metro, and that's a building boom that's going on across these economies. And so if governments are feeling the squeeze, then that's going to impact directly on construction firms as well. And then finally, the area of business that's probably most exposed to this government spending squeeze is firms that are facing consumers, because one of the key areas that governments are likely to have to cut, not just to achieve this balancing budget, but also to achieve some other policy objectives as well, is to reduce the level of public support for households, and therefore household incomes might suffer. But as economists are fond of saying, you can't cut your way to growth. Governments can't carry on cutting spending without it having a really serious impact on the long-term economic potential of economies. And so part of the balancing of budgets has to come through other measures. Now, one of the key measures is likely to be privatisation. So, for example, in the business press, we read a lot about the potential sale of a small part of Saudi Aramco, for example. But that's probably not a strategy that can work uniformly across the region. And part of the answer really does have to be an increased tax base. Now, the GCC region is pretty unique amongst high-income regions around the world in that it's got a very narrow tax base. This chart sets out the incidence of different types of tax rates across these economies. A black box indicates that there is that kind of tax for both native and expatriate workers, or native-owned and foreign-owned businesses. A light grey box indicates that the tax is selectively levied, and a white box, which looks like grey on this slide, indicates that that tax doesn't exist at all. And what you can see is that whereas in most high-income economies this entire grid would be black, in most of the GCC there's a very narrow tax base indeed. So what options does the government have? What options does the government in this region have to try and increase their tax base? Well, one measure we know that they're already going to be introducing is a value-added tax at 5%, and that's due in 2018. That will raise somewhere, we estimate, on the order of 1.5 to 2% of GDP. So it's an important contribution, but in the context that some countries in the region have deficits of over 10% of GDP, it doesn't go anywhere near enough closing that gap by itself. Other options may be to broaden the coverage of social security systems so that you could cover not just native-born workers in the social security system, but also expatriate workers. That would be an important way to raise revenue. I might also close the wage gap between native workers and migrant workers, and make it easier for the government to achieve its nativisation targets. And then finally, an additional option may be to introduce profit taxes. So the government could tax some firms in sectors, particularly where the degree of regulation and protection means that profits are quite high. So all of these are measures that the government could impose or could implement to try and help narrow that fiscal gap. But none of them constitute a free lunch. All of them would have some impact on businesses. For example, the VAT rate would increase households' living costs and therefore might actually increase the wages that they demand to come to work and hurt competitiveness of economies and firms. The social security tax, well, likewise, that could do the same. It would raise the cost of businesses and they would feel competitiveness impacts from that. And then finally, profits tax, that would also create a burden because firms rely on their retained earnings to fund investment. And if governments are deducting part of their profits, then they're less able to invest for the future. So there's no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to taxes. And in addition to all that, of course, you've got the administrative burden of managing these taxes, supplying your tax returns, and so on and so forth. And if you're currently in a low-income economy, then introducing new measures such as this will introduce red tape on your business. Another key priority that governments are very keen across the region is to increase the degree to which native-born workers are employed, particularly in the private sector. And a key barrier to that, of course, is the gap in wages that are typically demanded by expatriate workers versus native workers. Now, one measure that could be used to help solve that, of course, is reforms to welfare systems, lowering what economists call the reservation wage, the wage at which people demand before they will go into work. But an additional part of that really does need to be an increased focus on education. So this chart shows the World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Report scores for the quality of education as reported by businesses across the world. What you can see on the horizontal axis is the 2016 score, and on the vertical axis is the 2010 score. Now, two things are apparent from this. One is that there's a big difference across GCC economies and the Middle East more generally in the quality of education that firms are telling the World Economic Forum they're receiving for their workers. Qatar, UAE, Bahrain coming out the best as far as GCC economies are concerned. But probably the more interesting thing is that there doesn't seem to be a great deal of improvement in education as reported by businesses over the past 6 years. So firms aren't scoring particularly higher in 2016 than they were in 2010. If they were, then they'd be moving further down towards the horizontal axis. So firms are worried about the impact of cheaper oil on demand, their demand prospects. They're also worried about the possible impacts that it might have on the tax burden they have to pay, and also, in the longer run, the impact that might have on job creation and the fact that they need to provide the jobs for native-born workers. But they'll also be worried about the potential for exchange rate risk as we move into 2017. Most economies in the region have long been used to running very substantial trade surpluses, but in 2016, three economies within the GCC, Oman, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, were all running trade deficits of around 5% of GDP. And this raises the question about whether or not, in the interests of long-term diversification, the current level of currency pegs is necessarily sustainable for long-term economic growth. That's one way to think about exchange rate risk as we move into 2017. But it's also important to think about the exchange rate risk of sticking with currency pegs. So this chart shows the effective exchange rate of Bahrain's dinar against not just the US dollar, which is fixed, as you can see, the black line, but also the Bahraini dinar exchange rate against currencies in other parts of the world. And what you can see is that because it's fixed against the dollar, Bahrain's dinar is appreciated by around 20 or 30% against most of the rest of the world's economies. That's because the US dollar has been appreciating and it's dragging pegged currencies up with it. So firms will be worried about exchange rate risk from a number of angles. Firstly, whether or not the exchange rate regimes in the region are necessarily robust in the longer term, but also the competitiveness impacts that they're feeling right now from the dollar appreciation. But that's enough risks, that's enough bad news to be worried about for one presentation. There are more encouraging signs within the region's economies as we move into 2017, and foremost among those, we think, is the debut international bond issue by Saudi Arabia last month. This was encouraging for three reasons. Firstly, because it was Saudi's first international bond issue, so it's an important step into global bond markets. The second is because it was the largest bond issue by an emerging market in history, around $17.5 billion. But also because of the very affordable interest rate that the government was able to raise funds at, 3.25%, just 1.5 percentage points higher than the equivalent US Treasury bond. That's the benchmark bond for governments worldwide, and so it's a real vote of confidence from international markets, not just in the Saudi economy and the Saudi financial strategy, but also in the region more generally. What will that do for the real economy? Well, we think it will do a number of important things. Firstly, it will set a benchmark interest rate for other bond issues for the private sector to raise debt and so on. But it will also have an important impact in the banking sector as well, because when the Saudi government actually spends this money, it pays accounts with its suppliers, it deposits the money in the banking sector, it can really help reverse the drawdown of deposits that we've seen, not just in the Saudi banking sector over the past few months and quarters, but across the rest of the region as well. Lower oil revenues essentially have resulted in lower government deposits, and lower government deposits means less for banks to lend on. So the bond issue can form an important part of supplying extra finance for businesses to borrow. That's a liquidity squeeze that's been felt really quite widely across the region. This chart shows the retail deposit rate across GCC economies, and what you can see is that the cost of borrowing has gone up quite sharply over the past year or two. Now, this is one of the areas in which the bond issue can help, because an additional supply of funding into the Saudi banking sector can help bring that borrowing cost down and help more affordable financing for firms and eventual diversification. But that isn't a strategy that every government within the region can follow, to be honest. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, who we're anticipating will launch a couple of bond issues next year, are able to do that because their debt remains relatively low. But that isn't the case for countries such as Oman and Bahrain. Bahrain recently downgraded to junk status. And fundamentally, raising debt owing to creditors is no substitute for having a better economic environment in which private enterprise can thrive. And comparisons of the GCC economies with particularly emerging European economies are pretty unflattering in this respect. Only the UAE has a business environment that is ranked amongst the world's top 30, and typically GCC business environments are ranked outside the top 50. So there's a lot of work for governments to be doing to try and improve business environments and spur the kind of private sector growth that's going to be crucial looking forward. What that means is, for the economic outlook, is that we expect slightly slower growth in the years ahead. The GCC economies we think will grow by about 2.6% in 2017, and that's 1 percentage point slower than the average over the past 10 years. And within the GCC, there's quite substantial variation as well. So on the left-hand side here, we've got the GCC economies, and essentially what you see is that the economies that started their austerity programs earliest, Kuwait and Qatar in particular, have probably got the strongest growth prospects across GCC economies in 2017 and beyond. So just to conclude, to wrap up, what do we think is keeping businesses awake? Well, obviously the outlook for oil prices has always been key for this region and will continue to be so for quite some time yet. and not only the outlook for oil prices, but what it means for government policies, government spending, what that means for impact on businesses' demand, what it means for the tax measures that governments will have to implement in order to balance their budgets, and also the administration costs that those will impose on businesses. And then also the policy measures that the governments will need to implement to achieve their longer term goals, to increase native-born employment, and particularly question marks around whether the right people are available to fill the gaps currently filled by expatriate workers. And then also question marks around what the right level of exchange rate is to balance the cost of living against competitiveness and diversification. Now, sovereign debt, as we've seen in Saudi Arabia, can help with this transition path, but only as a transition. It's not a substitute for more fundamental reform, and the Saudi Vision 2030 and National Transformation Plan are key steps in that reform process. What can business do in order to help that transition? Well, two things essentially. First is to make sure that businesses have the appropriate technical specialist advice when it comes to tax planning. The new tax measures that may need to be introduced over the coming few years will require businesses to take up a bit of red tape, and it's important that businesses have the right support in dealing with that. But probably more important is that businesses are vocal about the kind of measures that they would need to adapt to this changing environment. So working with governments such that tax measures are implemented with a minimal administrative burden, and also tax measures can be implemented that don't inhibit and distort their investment plans for the future, but also to make the case for government for other measures to assist the transition to a post-oil economy. So things like welfare reforms to narrow wage gaps, increase labour market flexibility, wage bargaining power, and also things like investment allowances. So if firms are investing, then this is taken out of their corporation tax before they have to pay it. That's all I have to say. Hopefully that was insightful, but I'll be happy to take any questions.
Or maybe I'll just shout it out.
You can shout it, Asif.
No, I'll keep it simple, Tom.
Okay.
I think it's a fantastic presentation, and you've covered an incredible amount of ground in terms of the different issues. And if we stick to the topic, what is keeping businesses awake at night, clearly you mentioned the ones that are actually keeping us awake. But the fact that I've been here 14 years in Saudi Arabia, there might be two things that I would want to add, if I dare may. The first is, I think, the cost of doing business is going down.
Mm-hmm.
Companies need to realize now that they are being weaned of subsidies. They need to be receptive to the fact that there's a rationale behind all these subsidies being taken away from them. And that is spiking up the cost. With the Vision 2030, FDI is, we are becoming more receptive, the Saudi government is becoming more receptive to foreign investment coming in. That means some of these businesses that were just set up in silos, cocooned away from competition, they need to really wake up and realize that there is competition out there on pricing and whatnot. You in the passing mentioned also the thing about skill set, the right amount of skill set being available. So yeah, that's one thing that I believe that private businesses is definitely, that's something that's keeping the private businesses awake at night. The thing that I didn't really find in the presentation, and I do understand why it wasn't there, because it's not really an economic thing, it's more of a disruption, this technological disruption that's happening to the traditional businesses. I am ordering a pizza now on a digital app, and I'm doing that. So all the pizza producers out here in Saudi, if they are not on, if they don't have their own app, and that's probably a very weak example, but nonetheless, it does convey the point that I'm trying to make, is that there is disruption happening. Private businesses who will not be receptive to new ways of doing business, they are the ones who will have sleepless nights. So it wasn't a question, it was more
an observation. No, but a very, very true observation. But at the same time, you know, technological disruption gives businesses an opportunity to catch up quicker, right? So you know, regions that are, you know, not geographically situated right next to the major consuming regions like Europe or the US or China or Japan. They have an advantage, or the disadvantage that they're put at is reduced by technological disruption. And the key is, as you say, for governments to make it easy for businesses to make full use of that technology, because otherwise economies would be left behind by countries that are adopting that technology more quickly. Absolutely right. Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming to DSU. It was a very fantastic presentation. You know, my first observation, how real as real forecasting. For example, today afternoon, 2 hours back, there was a news in the BBC, Donald Trump, he announced he will quit the TPP.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another question, how real are the real forecasting? Because this is the McKinsey report 2015, the forecasting. World Bank, International Monetary Fund, like your Oxford Economics. So this forecasting will change a lot with the Trump factor. And we all agree with that. The reality is, however, from the macroeconomic perspective, few things from observation as an educator, or I feel like, the 15 to 64, the age group, is containing the highest number of population, out of 30 million people in South Asia. Most worrying factor, the female with the university education has the highest unemployment rate, which is more than 60%, 67% exactly.
Yeah.
And the labor market, like, the female nowadays, like, the university education with unemployment is unbalanced between the male and female. So there is a scope that females can participate to this pay gap. And then the research and development cost. Saudi is a high income country. However, the research and development contributing to GDP is less than 1%, less than 1%. So these factors are very much needed in line with the Saudi vision.
Yep.
These are the macroeconomic factors. So.
Yeah, I mean, forgive me. There's a lot of questions there. So let me just recap mine. So the final question you had was around R&D, and the second one was around female participation, and the first one was essentially around the uncertainty of economic forecasting, which you're absolutely right about. I mean, we were planning these reports a couple of weeks ago, thinking about the kind of themes we would be writing about, and in my head I had President-elect Clinton will raise the US minimum wage and it'll be fantastic for Chinese exporters because they can sell lots more consumer goods. And then I wake up on Wednesday, the 9th of November, and Donald Trump has won, and everything is very different. Now we're moving into 2017 and the political uncertainty doesn't stop. We've got presidential elections in France and in Germany. The prospect of a surprise in France is probably greater than it is in Germany, but who knows? But attention has really shifted towards France now, and the implications for the French presidential election of the Trump vote and the Brexit vote and the immigration that we've seen into the EU. So what all that means for the French presidential election and for the future of the EU in general is a question that I think people will start to focus on. Everyone's expectations is that Marine Le Pen won't be the next president of France, but then we said that about Donald Trump, and we said it about the EU's vote to stay in, the UK's vote to stay in the EU. So there's a lot of uncertainty around, and I think what you have to do is be prepared for scenarios. So we discussed our scenarios for the world oil price in an extreme Trump protectionist scenario, and also in a China slowdown scenario. It's about preparing for those scenarios and understanding what the world's going to look like if you wake up on November the 9th and Donald Trump's the president of the US. You also mentioned the challenges around female participation. So I read recently that either the proportion of students attending Saudi universities who are female is now 50%. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, approaching 50%. And yet the employment rate of female graduates hasn't shifted by anything like as much. And really the question there is around, well, a shift of culture and attitudes, and the question about whether or not a society really wants women to have the same opportunities for employment as men. But if it does, then providing the right kind of policy framework to support that. So support for childcare, support for flexible working, support for the kind of technological working that allows home working or remote working. Those are the key measures that the government, if it's to raise female participation, will have to actually be specific about when it implements its national transformation plan. And then you also had a question about R&D, and I believe it was something around how to raise R&D and to make it more powerful. The thing that we find when we look at R&D patterns is that it tends to be most powerful, and it tends to be most impactful on growth when it's carried out by commercial institutions for commercial reasons. If you look at the degree to which if you look across countries and you look at the degree to which governments are spending on R&D and firms are spending on R&D, it tends to be where firms are doing the spending that patents are registered and technological innovation is happening. And so the key for the government in Saudi Arabia has to be to provide the right environment for firms to innovate, but not necessarily be the ones doing the innovation itself.
One of the great news compared to all the GCC last 40 years, the patents within the GCC, Saudi has more patents than any other GCC countries. Like for example, Saudi Arabia has 1,512 patents over the 40 years, compared to United Arab Emirates is 200 or so. And so it's a great achievement within the GCC for Saudi Arabia from the commercial sector for the patent.
Do we have الأخوات إذا كان عندكم سؤال؟
Good evening. After all the information that has been said, I think it's the worst time to start a business right now. Isn't it so?
It's the worst time to start an oil business, I suspect. No, I think it's a good time. I mean, our former Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, used to say, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that's what is facing countries around the world, to be honest, in one respect or another. I mean, the Eurozone has had to undertake some incredibly painful reforms as a result of its debt crisis. The US had to do a lot of work cleaning up its banking sector after the housing bubble burst in 2007, 2008. And the GCC, Middle Eastern economies, oil-producing economies in general, are having to deal with the fact that oil prices are going to be very low, much lower than they're used to for the foreseeable future. And it's a question of how you adjust to that. Now, in that respect, private enterprise, startups, SMEs are a critical part of the transition to a new economic future for Saudi Arabia in particular. And these are some of the key goals within the Vision 2030 and within the National Transformation Plan. So it's a good time to be starting a business because government should be on your side. Everyone should be pushing in the same direction. It might be tough. Business conditions are going to be slower. Demand might be lower. But nevertheless, the framework should be pushing in the right direction to help starting a business become more possible than it was a year or two ago.
Yes, thank you for the amazing presentation. Now, there's some news that I read on Twitter that said 97% of the jobs that were generated throughout the year have been given to non-Saudi workers. And, what is in your opinion, do you think there's actually, a reasonable reason for something like this to happen? When 97% of generated jobs go to non-Saudis. And because of that, the unemployment rate in Saudi actually went up, even though the government has implemented Saudization in the private sector.
I mean, I think Saudization and the nativization agenda through an approach that's quota-based is very difficult for firms. It requires too often firms to put square pegs in round holes. What should be the focus really is getting workers' skills right, and there has been an increase in investment in education, but the question is whether or not it's producing the end results that firms need. And there's also a question about the balance between workers' wage expectations, particularly the difference between the wage expectations of expatriate workers and native workers who are eligible for relatively generous unemployment support. So the question is, to what extent is there an appetite to narrow that gap by basically incentivizing Saudi workers to take the kind of jobs that are typically taken by expatriate workers from overseas? I mean, this is a similar debate to what is going on in the UK and in the EU more broadly, the impact of migration from Eastern Europe into the UK in particular. But it's obviously more accentuated in the Middle East because the stock of inward migrant workers is so much higher. So as I say, it's not surprising to me, to be honest, but it's nevertheless a key challenge that governments in this region need to face going forward. And as I say, they have to do that by increasing workers' skills, making them better suited for the kind of jobs that firms want them to do, but also being honest with them about the kind of wages that they can expect in the future in private sector employment, particularly if they haven't invested in their skills. So the question was about whether or not the advent of renewable energy means that oil prices are actually likely to be much lower in the years ahead than we're forecasting. And also an observation that perhaps if Saudi Aramco was part privatised 2 or 3 years ago, then they could have raised $500 million rather than the likely $100 billion. But of course, the government didn't need $500 million a couple of years ago because oil was still $100 a barrel. So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't sometimes. The wider question about renewable energy is, it's absolutely right. I mean, most GCC economies are amongst the most carbon intensive in the world, despite the fact that the sun shines every day and solar energy would be free. And so one valuable way to help diversify and to help governments get their budgets back on track would be to try and accelerate that shift away from fossil fuels towards a low carbon environment. But the reality is that still is going to take a long time. Even if you assume that everyone went out tomorrow and everyone who was buying a new car bought a hybrid car, it would still take a long time for the entire car stock of the world to be replaced with an electric car. And the fact is that isn't happening yet. So I think for the foreseeable future, fossil fuels are going to be a key part of not just the transportation energy mix, but probably the wider energy mix as well. And if Donald Trump has his way in the US, then coal will make quite a comeback in the next few years as well. So not necessarily good news from an environmental perspective, or indeed from the cost-price perspective of fossil fuel producers. That's a pleasure.
Yes, let me ask one question. It's maybe a general question here. If I have money, should I go for stock market or should I keep it as dollars or reals or buy gold, or what should I do?
Well, I mean, our view is that interest rates are going to stay very low for a long time. In the US, we think that there's going to be one interest rate rise in December and one in 2017. But the reality is that interest rates are going to remain low for a very long time. That tends to be positive for world stock markets. And with the world economy starting to recover, corporate profitability around the world should start to recover as well. So particularly, for example, in the US, where the labour market is very tight now, wages are starting to rise, corporate profitability should start to improve, and that should be positive for stock market prices. But that isn't the case. That isn't the case in every part of the world. So it really depends where you're investing.
What in the Middle East?
Well, I mean, I think one of the key things about the Middle East is that stock markets tend to be relatively illiquid, right? I mean, there's very few listed companies to invest in, and so I mean, part of what the government will be aiming to do via Vision 2030 and the National Transformation Plan is help companies access a broader range of financing, and if that includes the stock market, then that's a positive thing.
One of the aspects of 23 Vision is to transfer Saudi Arabia into a global hub. So you think that Saudi Arabia could be a tax haven that could attract foreign investments in the future?
Well, I think there's two separate strands there. One is, does a country aspire to be a tax haven? Tax havens are getting an increasingly bad name around the world at the moment. Do you want to be somewhere that attracts foreign investment? Well, clearly yes. But it depends on the kind of skills that workers have as to how attractive an economy is going to be, particularly if they're not coming to invest in fossil fuels or issues closely related to fossil fuels like petrochemicals, the chemical sector, rubbers, synthetics, those kind of things. The goal to attract inward investment is obviously very important, and the emphasis placed on competitiveness indexes. So within the Vision 2030 and the National Transformation Plan, the government's made it explicit that it wants to move into the world's top 30 in the global doing business rankings. That's positive. But what I think investors will really want to see before they invest in Saudi Arabia or indeed in any other GCC economy over one of those Eastern European countries that I was picking out earlier is that they'll want to see specific measures that have been taken in 2017. They want to know that the aspiration is backed up by reality. They want to see a track record, and the sooner that begins, the sooner one can expect to see foreign direct investment creating jobs.
Okay, this is the last questions.
Yeah, just a quick question about education. You mentioned that it's kind of lagging in Saudi Arabia. I was wondering if you had any opinions about what the problems are, how to fix them, and to stay on topic, perhaps you could veer away from the social aspects, focus on an economic aspect. What's the UAE doing right that we're doing wrong? What can we improve?
I didn't quite catch the last line of that.
So what's the UAE doing right that we're doing wrong? When you mentioned that their education is better, and you can focus on an economic aspect. It doesn't have to be a social answer.
Well, the simple answer is I'd struggle to tell you exactly what the difference between what's going on in Saudi's education system and the UAE's is. I suspect it's probably a greater focus on results in the UAE. There does seem to be a greater willingness to adopt the modern methods, adopt technology within the UAE, and I suspect that's also the case within the education system as well. And perhaps that's one area that education reform in Saudi Arabia might particularly need to focus on.
In terms of economic policy as well?
Well, economic policy, essentially it's about financing education. But that doesn't seem to have been a problem for a long time, and so it's really about ensuring that teachers and people who run schools are incentivised in the right way. This is a debate we've had in the UK for a long time. Do you judge teachers by the results that they achieve, or do you accept that whatever results that they've achieved are the ones that were possible? And so, from an economist's perspective, if you were to try and achieve a greater degree of teacher incentivisation, then that's perhaps one way in which you can help achieve the results that businesses want. But also perhaps there's a greater degree for business to be involved in setting the agenda for education, helping people get real-world experience, helping them experience job roles perhaps that they might not be familiar with, or they might not consider as career options when they're in their educational years. I guess it's about really making sure that education works for business rather than education working for education's sake, essentially.
وفي الختام تتقدم الهيئة السعودية للمحاسبين القانونيين للحضور الكريم بالشكر والتقدير على تفضلهم بالمشاركة، كما تتقدم الهيئة بالشكر والتقدير للسيد توم روجرز المدير المساعد لمجموعة استشارات ماكرو الاقتصادية لتقديمه المحاضرة، وتتقدم أيضا بالشكر والعرفان لجامعة الأمير سلطان لاستضافتها لنا في هذا اليوم، والشكر موصول أيضا لشركة أرنست يونغ لرعايتها لهذا اللقاء. ويسر الهيئة أن تقدم عددا من الدروع التذكارية يقدمها سعادة أمين عام الهيئة الدكتور أحمد بن عبد الله المغامس، السيد توم روجرز المدير المساعد لمجموعة استشارات ماكرو الاقتصادية. سعادة ممثل جامعة الأمير سلطان الأهلية الدكتور محمد نور النبي. سعادة ممثل شركة أرنست يونغ في المملكة العربية السعودية الأستاذ فهد الطعيمي. وفي الختام نكرر الشكر للحضور وندعوكم لتناول بعض القهوة في البهو الخارجي، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.